Joining us from Capitol Hill this morning is Senator David Perdue, Republican of Georgia, and member of the Budget Committee, here to talk about how he wants to fix the budget process on Capitol Hill. And Senator, let me just begin with the Wall Street Journal headline that we've been sharing with our viewers this morning. U.S. budget deficit grew 39% in the first 8 months of this fiscal year. Is the president and Republicans responsible for this?
Well, of course not. I mean, in the last administration, we took a $10 trillion debt and doubled it. That's what happened under the prior administration. But here's the reality, Greta, and a couple of your callers alluded to it just now, and that is we have $22 trillion debt. How did we get there? In the year 2000, we had $6 trillion on about a $12 trillion economy. After President Bush, we had $10 trillion, so that was $4 trillion added behind two wars. President Obama comes in, we go from $10 trillion to $20 trillion, and right now, under President Trump, it continues to grow. Why is it growing? Discretionary spending is about 25% of what we totally spend as a federal government. We spend about $4.5 trillion, and about $1.5 trillion is discretionary. What does that mean? That's military, VA, and all discretionary domestic programs. So what's in mandatory? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, pension and benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt. Greta, today, all this talk about the budgeting process and the budget spending cap and all of that is talking about discretionary spending. We don't talk about mandatory. Discretionary spending today means that every dime that we're going to spend in discretionary spending is borrowed money, because we're adding about $1 trillion a year, and that is mostly because of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These trust funds are going to zero very shortly, and every year the losses in those trust funds are going up dramatically. That's what's driving this debt. So until we get on the mandatory side and save Social Security and save Medicare, this is an idle conversation that politicians do here in Washington.
Well, what is your Fix Funding First Act, and how would it deal with what you were just talking about?
Well, Greta, thank you so much for having me on and let me talk about this a minute. We've been working for 4.5 years since I got elected. Nobody does budgeting and appropriating the way the U.S. federal government does. This is how bad it is, and I'll talk about the Funding First Act here in just a second. We want to change the way we fund the government so we do it on time every year. The drama that we have up here causes all sorts of problems, and it causes the debt to go up. We have only funded the government, Congress has only funded the government on time by the end of the fiscal year 4 times in the last 45 years since the 74 Budget Act was put in place. They've actually used 186 continuing resolutions, which is devastating to our military, causes costs to go up all across the government, and they've actually shut the government down. Congress has shut the government down because it didn't fund the government 21 times over the last 45 years. My act is a first step, and it's an outgrowth of a year-long effort last year by a joint select committee, 16 members of Congress, and 4.5 years of a working group in the Senate working on this to come up with a better way to fund the government. It basically is built on a couple of precepts. One is that the budget should be a law. It's not even a law today, Greta. Secondly, everything we spend should be included in the budget. And third, we have to have consequences for Congress, just like the states do, if we don't get it done on time. It's just that simple.
So, Senator, how would this, though, address mandatory spending for Social Security and Medicare?
Well, in a second step, the first step you have to do is address the fiscal year. I propose that we change the fiscal year, that we go to a biennial budgeting, which is wide support up here. The third thing is that you really get into a series of due dates within the appropriating process. Look, appropriators get their jobs done. Last year, we appropriated about 75% of the budget by the end of the fiscal year. It's the first time in 22 years they did that. We stayed here in August to make that happen. And so when you get that done, then you can move over and start dealing with the mandatory side. And this is the way I feel about that. Right now, we are funding a deficit in Social Security and the Medicare Trust Fund such that the Medicare Trust Fund goes to zero in 7 years, Greta, and the Social Security Trust Fund goes to zero in 12 years. At that time, then we'll have to use money from the general account to subsidize those trust funds. And then, at that point, that needs to be considered in the budget and appropriating process. It's as simple as that.
Senator, I want to just share with this article that maybe you've seen it this morning in the business section of the New York Times. We're sharing with our viewers on Social Security, and says unless a political solution is reached, Social Security's so-called trust funds are expected to be depleted within 15 years. Then something that has been unimaginable for decades will be required under current law. Benefit checks for retirees will be cut by 20%.
Well, nobody's going to allow that to happen. The reason I've been calling fire on this thing for the last 4.5 years is because you can see those dates. Some say 15. The OMB up here, Office of Management Budget, and the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, use more like the 12-year on Social Security, but it could be 5 years depending on how fast they let that trust fund deplete. So we're not going to let that happen, but right now is the time to do it. Since 1983, when Alan Greenspan and President Reagan at that time and Tip O'Neill, they tried to negotiate a fix for Social Security. They knew it was coming. We've known for 30 years that this day was coming. In 1965, when they liberalized the Social Security structure, they knew then that one day this thing would be bankrupt because of the baby boom bubble, and here we are. We're within a decade, Greta, by anybody's measure, of having to face that down. And even worse than that is the Medicare trust fund will come to zero before then. And so we have to find a way right now to save those. Social Security can be saved, but that's not part of what we're doing right now. We want to fix the budget process to come up with a politically neutral platform that will allow us to fund the government on time and not have it be a political vehicle that one party who happens to be in the majority in either house can drive down the throat of the minority their view of the fiscal reality of our country. We need a bipartisan solution every year without all this drama.
Senator, how do you get this fix approved? How do you get, lawmakers, some of them who have been up there for many, many years, to change the process?
Well, Greta, that is the question, and thank you for getting to that question, because that's the problem. They've dealt with this before. Every budget chairman, every appropriating chairman for the last 30 years, they've all talked about this. What we did last year was we put pressure on leadership, and leadership agreed to create a joint select committee, Democrats, Republicans, House and Senate, and we agreed on several precepts. We just couldn't get a comprehensive bill. So we believe now that in the Senate we're going to be putting forth things like my act here that put forward some of these details, like changing the fiscal year to December 31 from September 30th, so that the first year of a Congress doesn't start out 3 months behind. Moving to biennial budgeting. A lot of states do this. And by the way, the model for this is really most of the states' process, by the way, Greta. They get it done. They work 40, 45 days a year. Their primary responsibility is to fund the state government. And if they don't get it done, they don't go home. So what we've got to do is build some consequences in here. My bill proposes that, but it's just a placeholder to start the debate. I really believe that Senator Enzi, who's the chairman of the Budget Committee, is on the right track, that if we do this in a piecemeal basis, start with the easy things and prove that we can pass some of these easy issues, we can tackle some of the bigger items as we go.
What are some of the consequences, Senator, for not getting the job done?
Well, it's very simple. First of all, we wait and try to get it all done at the end, and nobody in the real world does it. Look, I'm a business guy, and you have to have due dates along. If you're going to try to get everything done by the end of the fiscal year, you better start doing it early. And so what we proposed last year, and it worked, we did the 302As, which is a top line budget first, and we started appropriating earlier. So what we've done is said, look, let's break the appropriating process of this $1.5 trillion on discretionary spending, again, which is all we deal with in the budget process. Break it down into 4 components, put a due date on it, and if we don't get that component done and appropriated by that date, then nobody goes home on that state work week. It's as simple as that. So we have these various times during the year, and believe me, I believe that would work.
Senator Perdue, by the way, the only Fortune 500 CEO serving in Congress. He was the CEO for Reebok and Dollar General stores. And Senator, explain to our viewers why Congress faces this deadline to deal with budget caps. Remind our viewers when this happened and why we're back at this point.
Well, Congress, in an attempt years ago, back in the early part of the Obama administration, all of us agreed after the 08 and 09 issue that we had to control spending, and so we put a Budget Control Act that would limit the spending. And if you went over that, it automatically kicked in a sequestration where you cut 10% across the board. In business, nobody does that. You go to your weak divisions and you cut those, and you go to your strong divisions and you invest. One of your callers earlier said, we talked about infrastructure. One of the ways to grow the economy is to build the infrastructure. Well, where's the money going to come from? So these are all the issues you need to talk about. The Budget Control Act has never worked in the way that it was intended, and what it did do is it crippled the military, because over 60% of the cuts over the last decade came out of the military. They cut the military by 25%, such that our readiness was at a situation where we couldn't protect the country anymore. That's a fact. 2 years ago, when President Trump came into office, our readiness was at an all-time low. We had the smallest Army since World War II, the smallest Navy since World War I, and the oldest and smallest Air Force. We could not fulfill the responsibility the Constitution gives us, and that is to protect the country. So this is why we have to get past this Budget Control Act this year. I believe that we'll do that. Both sides understand the severity of this. We don't want to have another, quote, shutdown conversation. That's just immature and irresponsible. What we need to do is get past that, come up with a top line number, and get these appropriating bills on the floor of the Senate, and I think we're moving to do that right now.
When is your deadline, and where do negotiations stand?
Well, September 30th is the real deadline. That's the deadline for funding the government for the next fiscal year. We've got to get the military and HHS, because those two things typically are put together. But it's coming up now in the next few weeks that we are going to have to get past this deadline. So my view is that every day here, we should not go home on Fridays. We should be here on the weekends. I mean, this is, and I'm not pandering here, Greta, I really think it's going to take that kind of intensity to force both sides to face up to this crisis. We're in a funding crisis right now. And the reason we're not talking about it is because we have an attack in the Oman Gulf. We have all the other topics to talk about. But this one is going to be front and center very, very shortly. And I think the quicker we can do it, the better we're going to be.
The House, led by Democrats this week, started mini buses, as they're known here in Washington, spending packages. The one they have on the floor yesterday and today is 4 different spending bills put into one package. Where is the Senate in the spending process?
Well, the appropriators have been working, but we don't have a top line number. And this is the breakdown in the system. The budget process, we passed a budget in the Senate earlier this year. The House hasn't even passed a budget yet, and now they're starting appropriating. And this is my point. It's so dysfunctional. The process is supposed to have a budget process, an authorizing process, and an appropriating process. And, you know, the House has bypassed most of that. The Senate does it most every year the same way. It's ridiculous. What we've got to do right now in the Senate, though, is to get a top line number. This is where, generally at the end of the year, if you don't have the budget and you don't have an agreement on it, 8 people from the administration and the leadership in Congress get together and decide on what that top line number is, and then they appropriate very quickly against that. That's where we are right now. And if we did that immediately, we should have done it in January this year, but if we did it immediately, we could get past the budget control problem and move on to appropriating. And then I think we got a good chance of getting most of it done before the end of September.
Senator David Perdue, Republican of Georgia, member of the Budget Committee. We thank you for the conversation this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Greta.